It was sold as something that was going to be big news. And, call it a plan for change. I feel like I've heard all of this before, but this was, in the 1940s, the nationalisation of previously private development rights. Suddenly, you own land, it's not up to you what you do with it, it's up to the government.
Having been on the inside, I could say the overwhelming pressure to say something and do something on everything is crazy.
This trend on the right to say, and actually, the economists have been completely wrong about immigration. Although free movement of everything else is economically helpful, free movement of labour, that's bad.
Hello and welcome to the IEA Podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Communications here at the IEA, and today I'm joined by Tom Clougherty, our Executive Director, and Kristian Niemietz, our Editorial Director. The IEA Podcast tries to get under the bonnet of the week's headlines, below the shallow political commentary and into the issues that really matter to classical liberals. This week, the Prime Minister Keir Starmer delivered a big reset, non-reset speech, whichever way you look at it, on his plan for change. He set out a number of milestones and targets for a range of things, from the economy to police and crime to healthcare, which we'll be getting into. One of the biggest things, I think, part of that speech was his mission for growth, his vision for growth, which he started talking more about people's livelihoods and how well off they feel, as opposed to necessarily just always talking about comparing GDP growth to other countries. Tom, what was your takeaway from it?
I have to say, I didn't watch the speech, I read it. I found it extraordinarily underwhelming, right? Because it was billed as this big reset. It's a little funny that the government needs a reset 6 months into government and whatever. But nevertheless, I think it was sold as something that was going to be big news. And, call it a plan for change. I feel like I've heard all of this before. If you gave me that speech and said it was Rishi Sunak's speech from 3 years ago or 2 years ago or whatever, I was, well, yeah, sure, it's kind of the same thing. I think basically what it amounts to is saying we are going to achieve good things by being better. There's no theory of change to any of this. Now, it's lots of the pledges are good pledges, right? No one would object if most of these things are achieved, although probably the 95%, carbon-free or clean power by 2030. Look underneath the bonnet of that one, I think there are some pretty significant problems, and possibly that involves very expensive, unreliable energy, which cuts against the growth mission. But look, if we just focus on the economic bit for a moment, there's something interesting there. We often talk about growth and we talk about productivity and we talk about GDP. It doesn't mean much to ordinary people. And I think the way that people see GDP or they feel economic progress is basically in what's happening to their real disposable incomes. Right? How much money do they have to spend on the things that they want? And we've got a terrible record on that in this country over the last 15 years. Since the financial crisis, the real median wage has essentially been flat. It may have grown a little bit. Now, disposable income for the people in the middle, the median earner, has increased a little bit, not very much, not so much so that people will be grateful and think governments have done a great job over the last decade and a half. But here's an interesting thing. The only reason that people have more pounds in their pockets over the last 15 years is because taxes on middle earners are lower than they were. Or at least, on the employee side, obviously you've seen the big hike in employers' national insurance coming in now. I don't think that avenue is going to be open to this government. It's not kind of in their mindset. It doesn't go along with their whole political project of more spending and more investment and so on. I think to be cutting taxes on middle earners. So what does that mean? You want more pounds in people's pockets? Well, it has to mean productivity increases. And we have to get out of this growth funk that we've been in since the financial crisis. And, that's great. Good to have that ambition. Good to put it in terms that people understand. But what I want is some sense of how this is going to be achieved. And you don't really get that from the speech. And I don't see it more broadly in this government's agenda. Now, the one thing which is encouraging, or maybe there's a couple of things that are encouraging in this speech, actually. So the first one is that I think the Prime Minister had some, by his standards, tough words for Whitehall, for the blob, and saying, they lack ambition and they're too happy to manage decline. Okay, good. Nice to hear that. The other thing, of course, is on building. Now, building 1.5 million homes, it would be a big achievement because we haven't been doing that recently. actually, it's not enough homes. It depends a lot on where those homes are. Are you building them where prices are highest and where market signals are telling you desperately need more homes here? Are you scattering them around the country pointlessly in line with government plans instead of those market signals? But it's good. I mean, I think it's very good, actually, that the government is making that so central and that they're sort of staking political capital on it, that we will get Britain building not just houses but infrastructure projects as well. But I think, again, the question is how? Where is the theory of change? What policies are going to shift to make this happen? Because we've heard it from governments before, right? And they've always run into trouble. They've always caved. What makes us convinced that this time is going to be different? And I know you shouldn't expect too much from a political speech, but if you think back when Tony Blair gave these big sort of keynote speeches, particularly in his later years when he adopted that big public service reform agenda, I think there was actually a lot that policy people could kind of get their teeth into, because he was talking about structural changes around choice and competition and accountability and all of that kind of thing. And as I said, what I see here in this speech is good ambitions, probably a genuine conviction to try his best to deliver on those pledges, but no real sense of how it's going to happen.
Yes, I completely agree. I think there's a lot to get into there, not least I think the point about there not being any theory for change is maybe a bit of a trend we've seen in politics over the past, maybe started by Rishi, but the sort of a bit of managerialism where everybody, here's some good things we want to do, but yes, how do we get there? Kristian, you said yesterday that we've seen it all before. But today, Keir Starmer's obviously listened to you and they come out with an op-ed in the Times. He said, I know with trust in politics so low, the public are sceptical of promises made by politicians. That's directed straight at you, Kristian. Where there are blockers putting the brakes on is a sign of delivering real change. He's saying he's up for the fight to deliver the infrastructure projects and the really radical things that we need to do to make the economy work. Do you believe him?
I wouldn't go that far, but I was positively surprised by that Times article, because if you strip out the bits that are nakedly political, the first half of it also could have been written by one of us. Right? You could almost write one of those. I could imagine Monbiot or Open Democracy writing one of their conspiracy theory articles about how Starmer's speeches or articles are now ghostwritten by Tufton Street. There is a lot in there that could really be from us. There is where it differs from the Sunak era or, say, Tory politicians making similar noises is that when they talked about building things, for them, this was more narrowly about first-time buyers. So they had this idea that we need to build a bit more because first-time buyers, once they become homeowners, they become more likely to be they're more likely to become conservatives. So they thought of this in more narrowly electoral terms. Starmer seems to think of our lack of building, our inability to build things as more than that, as what's holding back the economy. So he sees this through a more macroeconomic lens, sees that as the bottleneck to economic growth, and I think that's correct. That's the way to approach this. That this isn't just a problem narrowly for the residential housing sector, but that it is about infrastructure, about business premises, about energy. He mentions, he singles out water reservoirs. So that there is this broader problem of blockage, of economic activity having to take place somewhere. It needs physical space, physical infrastructure where it can happen. And he identifies that correctly, and that hasn't happened in that way before. So, yeah, it would be easy to dismiss it by saying, well, this is just rhetoric. But rhetoric is not irrelevant. It does set a tone and expectations. So if he does nothing of that, it could well happen, but it would be held against him at least. So he is raising the future cost for himself, for his own government, of under-delivering. And at least he is starting from the right diagnosis. So this may not be something that comes from the bottom of his heart. So it's clearly a last-minute conversion. Until a year ago or so, he never said anything of that sort. And then had this last-minute conversion to YIMBYism. It was quite clearly he was desperately looking for something, some agenda to make his, other than not being a Tory and not being Corbyn, and that's what he found. But if he found the right thing by accident, that's good enough. And but the problem is still what you mentioned. There's not much on the delivery. So what he says is on the delivery side, he wants to fast track things. Okay, yeah, that sounds good, but you have to ask, why is it slow to begin with?
Yeah. Is it not though that actually the biggest barrier for these sort of reforms is basically being up for the fight? You need to be able to take on quite loud, quite politically painful protests to whatever you're trying to do, be it build houses or build roads or whatever. Is actually not the fact that he's not just saying he's going to do it and saying it's going to be tough, but he's saying bring it on. The blockers shows that we're trying to do, that we're moving in the right direction almost.
Yeah, and I think there's some truth in that. Clearly, this is one of those difficult issues for politicians, and you have to be up for the fight, as you say. I think the problem, though, it's very easy to get into this mindset, and I think you see it a lot on the right of politics as well. There's this sort of the idea of Margaret Thatcher, the lady's not for turning and everything, just refusing to back down, ploughing through against protest and everything. And I think it gives people the idea that that's how you achieve change. You just have to will it hard enough and you can make it happen. I think the problem actually is that, what is really at issue when you talk about the lack of building? It's the planning system, and it's the way it empowers all of these blockers to get in the way of development. And, it's kind of gone beyond the planning system now. There are so many other things layered on top of it, your environmental regulations, all your consultations and judicial reviews and everything else. It's a structural problem. And I think you can use a lot of political capital, and you can kind of try and impose your will and say, like, this is my mission and I will make it happen. And maybe you can make it happen for a little while. But if it takes that kind of extraordinary executive effort to just get things built that people want to build, like the private sector wants to build things and government is stopping them, it's only a temporary solution if it's any kind of solution at all. And so that I think is the danger. To frame this in confrontational terms is almost to accept the premise that the planning system, which is the problem.
Yeah.
Well, I think you need a bit of both. Initially, it needs to happen through confrontation. If you want to make it last, then at some point you will have to change incentives around it, and you can then move to an accommodation phase where you said, okay, I've now plowed through my controversial bits, and now I'll try to get some buy-in to make sure that this becomes more palatable. But one mistake that previous governments, the Tory governments, have made was they always started from the premise that there isn't really such a thing as a NIMBY. There is just opposition to bad development projects. And if you do everything right, everyone will support it. And that is just not true. We have to accept that NIMBYism is not a rational response to anything. It is mostly a visceral and emotional thing. And there are some of the NIMBY lobby are just people that you cannot reason with. And you're not going to win them over by saying, oh, look, we've got a nice design code here and you can have your say. That's not going to work. You have to initially get it through in the Thatcherite way, the way Thatcher took on the miners. And then later on, you can move to things like saying, okay, from now on, we will also make sure that you benefit from some of the tax revenue that this new development will bring. You can then move to the stage where you have to ask yourself, what do I need to do to make this last, to make sure that the next government won't simply overturn all of that again? But I think Starmer is right to start from the premise that this will initially be unpopular and there will be opposition. If you start by thinking, I will do it in the right way and therefore there will be no resistance, then you just run into the problem that there obviously will be resistance. And if you're totally unprepared for that, or if these people are not supposed to exist from your perspective, then you won't know how to handle that opposition, and then you will get to the situation that we had in 2020-21, where the Tories lost one seat in a by-election over was it building car? No, it was the generic planning reforms, and then they immediately panicked and U-turned.
Yeah, and so they're not starting from the place where basically all Tories try to start from, which is, well, we want to build houses, and we want to build things, but it needs to have local buy-in, local say. The Liz Truss leadership campaign was all about, I remember, being about getting rid of top-down housing targets and it being local and up, and somehow that magically being the way we're going to build things, which I think, Kristian, as you are right to say, is...
Yes. Yeah. I mean, fix the system, you can get rid of the targets. The targets are probably essential to getting anything built or approved by any councils around the country, given the crazy system that we have at the moment. But yeah, you do need to go deeper on this stuff, I think. You wrote about this in Home Win. I mean, the kind of the phased approach, that Home Win being a recent IEA publication, the phased approach you just outlined, is kind of what you talk about in that pamphlet, right?
Yeah, I think there was... in an earlier version, I think there was something where for those who haven't read it, it's set in a hypothetical future where you have a YIMBY government and they do try to sort out the housing crisis and succeed. And I think in an earlier version of that, my hypothetical government had two factions within it where it was exactly about this good cop, bad cop distinction. You had the ones who said, well, NIMBYs are the enemy and we need to crush them. And the ones who say, oh, no, well, let's be nice to them. We need to win them over. And the way they do it in the end is that the bad cop has a go at it first. They do all the confrontational stuff and treat NIMBYs as the enemy. And then later on, they move to the stage where the nice people, the good cop, takes over. And then they say, well, now that we've got the basic obstacles out of the way, we'll give you some of the things that you like.
I think you are right, Kristian, that it's very welcome that they are so clearly identifying the growth problem and the living standards problem with the inability to build things. And that is new. Perhaps that's been bubbling up over the years. But to make it so central to the agenda, very encouraging. But in a sense, there's still a step further they need to go. So it's like, well, we have the growth problem, and we think the growth problem is because we have a building problem to a certain extent. Why do we have a building problem? And in a way, it's strange, right, that we've been talking so much about this issue, that it's become so salient in politics. But the whole concept of the British planning system is just sort of taken for granted. But of course, we have a planning system. This to me, it is probably the single biggest problem in our political economy, that we have this crazy system that was set up, remember, by a socialist government that was seeking to control the means of production and everything else. After all, it was basically a massive nationalisation. Yeah. People don't think of it in those terms because it's largely been supported by conservatives. But this was, in the 1940s, the nationalisation of previously private development rights. Suddenly, you own land. It's not up to you what you do with it. It's up to the government. And we seem to be some way away from dealing with that absolutely fundamental underlying question. Now, the other thing I think is just worth mentioning before we move on to another topic here, is the planning system, building stuff, is very important for living standards. It's very important for growth. It's not the only thing, I think, that matters. And if you look at the agenda more broadly, maybe they'll do some good stuff on building houses and infrastructure. Maybe, if you're honest about it, it's just doing kind of the bare minimum that we should be doing of the country of our size and level of development and everything. But what else? What else is going to sort of boost growth? What else is going to boost real wages? Now, yes, if we had a development boom, it would in time improve productivity. Partly just because, if you can build more in the places where demand is highest and you can get more people moving to prosperous centres and bigger agglomeration effects and everything, that's all very positive economic news. But even if they achieve what they're saying and they have 1.5 million houses and they have 150 infrastructure projects, it's a lot better than nothing. And I'll say hats off, good job. Is it really going to move the dial that much from this long slump we've been experiencing now? And, we're probably not going to talk about it a great deal on this podcast. We talked about it last week. But his sixth pledge was on the 95% clean power by 2030. So real doubling down on the environmental agenda. Nothing surprising there, of course. But one of the big constraints that we have on growth in this country is just how expensive energy is, particularly for businesses. And I was just looking at this the other day. In the early 2000s, probably right around the turn of the millennium, the industrial price of energy was pretty much the same in the UK and the US. It was ever so slightly higher, a few pennies higher in Britain than in America. But those lines, America's has kind of flatlined along the bottom. Ours has just shot up. And this was happening before Russia invaded Ukraine. It's become even more pronounced since. This is something that I think does feed into our economic performance. The government's going the wrong direction on it. Tax as well, employment law. I suppose from the Chancellor recently, there were some encouraging noises on financial regulation, which I do think, it's not a coincidence that there's a kind of pre-financial crisis growth trend, and then there's a post-financial crisis growth trend. Clearly, the way we've regulated financial services and the way we've done that differently from the United States, I think probably explains some of the differing performance there. But this is just to say, I know we're sometimes accused of going on and on about the planning system. A lot of other things matter as well. Energy, financial regulation, tax, employment law. And what they're saying on planning is great, but it's not enough.
One final point on this. So even though it's true that we've been banging on about, and not just us, lots of people have been banging on about the planning system for a long time. What is quite new is it's only really happened in recent years that more people think of this as a constraint on growth overall, as opposed to something that just affects renters. So it was definitely when I wrote about this for the first time, I think 2012 or so, and I initially also just thought of it as, I came across the issue when I was writing on poverty, and I thought of the housing shortage as a cause of poverty, something that traps people in poverty, and in various ways. Firstly, of course, directly by raising their rents, but also because it then triggers housing benefit with the withdrawal rates and all that, stops people from moving from poor parts of the country to richer parts. But I still thought of it primarily as this is something that affects poor people. But if you are an above average income earner, this isn't your problem really. And that wasn't true. It isn't a narrow problem that is only confined to the bottom fifth or third or whatever of the income distribution. It's an economy-wide problem, and we should really see it as the bottleneck on productivity growth overall.
Indeed, and actually more than that, I mean, just to bring us on to our next topic, Starmer has also promised, well, the Labour Party have been promising for a long time, to put 13,000 new community police officers on the street, more bobbies on the beat, if you like, which I want to have a little look at because it's quite interesting. I mean, you ask what relevance crime is to the sort of classical liberal agenda. I think there is one, but that's a slightly different topic we'll get into another day. But it's worth looking at for a few reasons. Firstly, because first of all, it's another sort of welcome step. It's a good thing. Community policing is a good thing in that it is literally having police officers on the street going to the places where crime happens and stopping it, and it works. We know it works, so it should be welcomed. There's an interesting government planning, control, top-down dynamic to all of this. They've said they're going to hire 13,000 police officers. That's actually not quite right. It's a mix of 3,000 police officers that they've already got, hiring 3,000 new ones. There's 4,000 PCSOs, which are full-time officers, but not, they don't have the police community support officers. They don't have full powers of arrest, and 3,000 special officers, special constables who are part-time volunteers, but they do have full powers of arrest. Anyway, this is the Home Office saying, we want to improve community policing, and we are going to prescribe nice round numbers from the centre of government on the sorts of officers you need, and make sure that we'll give you lots of money to hire these very prescribed, and we'll send out to all the force areas. They'll say, well, here's a budget for you filling sort of 10% of that quota or whatever, to the Met, for example. So we saw this with the Conservative government previously, who promised to hire, and did hire successfully, 20,000 new police officers. But the unintended consequences of this is really interesting, because you end up having, the government says, look, to force areas, to chief constables, here's a load of money that you can spend on hiring new officers. Brilliant, we'll do that. But then you don't have that money accessible to hire backroom staff. And as much as we like to sort of say we're over-bureaucratising, we want less backroom staff and more bobbies on the beat, there are some backroom roles that are quite key. And then what we've seen is the reverse civilianisation of the police force. So you've got people in backroom staff who are trained to arrest people, but they can't get out on the street because they're having to run social media accounts or other more important things. Which I think is really interesting. So So although the focus on community policing is welcome because we know it works, why is the government being even more prescriptive and not just saying to force areas? We've set up this system of police and crime commissioners and 43 force areas around the country where chief constables run sort of the police force in their area, and it's supposed to be closer to the people and sort of in a liberal fashion, and sort of the people closer to the ground can make the decisions better. But then you're saying, well, you need to hire this type of person, not this type of person. I think a much better way to do it would be to say, here's a lump of money, spend it how you can best spend it on increasing your capacity in whichever way is possible. And then they can hire people to run the social media accounts and get the officers who are doing that on the street. And that maybe won't cost as much. But I think that the issue with policing is as with many political issues, is that it comes down to what is politically palatable, right?
You see this phenomenon not just in policing but across the public sector, right? This idea that politicians always want to focus on the front line.
Yeah.
And that sounds good. But what it actually means is that the people who you think are frontline are actually spending all of their time doing admin and processing. I mean, I understand this from police officers that if you arrest someone, basically that's your work day gone because you're doing paperwork and everything the rest of the day. And you see it in hospitals as well, where doctors are basically, I mean, I've heard stories about doctors basically spending hours waiting for the computer to be free so they can type in the notes and that kind of thing. This is appalling for productivity. And this is one of the problems, as you say, with centralisation, with having a single view and imposing it kind of down through a system like this. It may appear to you at the top of the tree that the way to do something is, well, you need these staff to do this. And, it may be that the research or the evidence shows that's the way to do it. But you don't really know how it's going to work when it filters through the system and everything is rife with unintended consequences. And I think was maybe Steve was talking about this on our last podcast, how basically this, he said, I think this always happens with militaries over time, that they become more and more kind of top-down command and control. I mean, that's essentially what you think of militaries as being like, right? But he says actually when countries face big crises, they realize actually militaries don't work as big bureaucratic entities. You have to radically decentralize power and give people a lot of opportunities to make their own decisions based on the conditions on the ground. Fundamentally, you look at public services, and there are all sorts of problems with them, not least the lack of a price mechanism, the lack of competition and all of this kind of stuff, but also this mindset of centralized top-down control is really problematic, I think. And maybe, as much as we would like everything to be marketized and competitive, if you can't have that, then a degree of decentralization of political power is helpful, because at least then there's a kind of quasi-competition where if people don't like the services over here, well, they can go and try it and it will be done differently somewhere else. That's a little bit unfair to expect people to sort of move around based on how good is the policing in their area. But at least if you can see this police force over here is doing really well, this police force here is doing really badly, you can learn something. Whereas if you just try and impose everything from the top down, you lose what little kind of evolutionary process you might otherwise have in a non-market setting.
That's a really good point. And there's an interesting side point to the police as well, is that they're quite keen to police. You don't need to prescribe things from central government, specifically who you're going to hire. What you can say is, here's lots of money, we really care about community policing, and they'll be like, okay, great, we'll do our best on that front then. So you can sort of give that overall direction without trying to sort of drive the train from Whitehall. But the next point on the crime question comes back to the start of the discussion, which is it's all well and good hiring more community police officers, but where do you put prisoners now, once you've where do you put criminals, once you've arrested them, because we have a huge prisons crisis, which gets back into the failure of governments over the past decades, actually, on this to build the infrastructure we need, and that is in this instance prisons. There was actually an NAO report out yesterday that gave a fairly damning indictment of the old government's pledge to deliver 20,000 prison places by the mid-2020s. Now, that mid-2020s was sliding when I was in the MOJ, and I had to do a bit of the fudging on the dates. But that is now slid to 2031. Current expansion plans are insufficient to meet estimated future demand. That is a complicated way of saying we're going to run out of prison places again. in a number of in a few years. Expansion costs are expected to be at least 80% above original estimates in 2021. So it's yet another example of what you were saying, Kristian. It's not just housing. It's not even just economic growth, but it's how does the country function as a whole if you can't build the prisons to keep the criminals off the streets.
Yeah, I can see why to an outside observer it may seem like we're obsessed with this because it always comes back to that, but I don't think it's our fault. It's just that you pick almost any policy area, you dig a little and you find a planning aspect of it. Even where it's not the only thing, it is at least an aggravating factor. And as you said yesterday in your article that of course, you can have a more efficient criminal justice system, but ultimately the bottleneck is where do you put the criminals? If they don't go anywhere, then you're just back to square one. And going back for a moment to the decentralization aspect, I mean that is basically how it works between the Swiss cantons. I don't think that somebody would move from canton A to canton B specifically because the policing system is better, but it becomes part of a package of services. Of public services and taxes, and you choose according to that. It's like a bundled good. It's like say a competition between shopping centers. You compare the whole package rather than specifically one shop or one aisle within the shop. And that can be quite market-like. But what you need to do if you decentralize those powers is you need to decentralize the financing of it as well. You need to have more local taxation so that you get, even when people don't physically move, then you get at least a benchmark competition. You can say, well, look, in the neighboring region, crime rates are pretty similar, demographics are pretty similar. Why do they only pay half as much? Why does it have to cost twice as much here for the same results? Or why do they get much better results for the same tax level?
I'm glad we're reviving an old Niemietz meme. Questions to which the answer is Switzerland. Always a good one. Yeah, I mean, just to touch, we won't maybe go into it in depth, but you said maybe this seems like an odd topic for classical liberals to talk about. And I'm not sure it is, actually. I mean, the fact that you believe in a small state and in a market economy, it doesn't mean, I think, that you completely ignore the things that the state actually should do. And that, in fact, the reasons a state exists, basically, to provide law and order and external defence, we may have a particular take on the best way for policing court system to operate and so on. But I don't think it's an illegitimate topic to think about at all. And one of the interesting trends over the last 15 years, maybe it goes back longer than that, is that what we as classical liberals would think of as the core functions of the state, the things that even a kind of night watchman state libertarian would say, well, this is the state's job, it's precisely those things that actually have been the most neglected, I think, probably the most starved of funds. And it's probably part of this big long-term transition from having a state which, provided law and order and ruled the high seas and stuff, and had a little welfare function, to the welfare function growing bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and everything else kind of fading relatively and then actually being squeezed in absolute terms as well. And, probably we've run out of road on that, actually. We probably can't squeeze the core functions of the state that much in order to pay for old people pensions or healthcare or whatever. I think inevitably that's going to raise hard questions about the welfare state. But I think we're probably, not us, but Westminster politics is some way off grappling with that kind of issue at the moment.
I think that's right. I think people of our ilk, libertarians, some conservatives, like to say quite often the line, I believe the state should do less but better. There's a lot of focusing on what it should be doing less, but I also agree that we should also be focusing on the bits that we think it should be doing but better, police, defence and those sorts of things.
Yeah, but it would also be if we had a state that does a lot less, it would also mean that it would be possible to monitor the things that it does. So if policing were a big part of, say, election campaigns because the state does little else, then it would be possible for somebody who isn't terrifically politically informed to compare manifestos and say, well, this concept makes more sense to me than that one. And that just becomes impossible when manifestos are just massive packages of everything, from financial regulation to
football regulation. The football regulator thing. Yeah, I mean, there was, as I understand it, a big literature on government overload. some decades ago, and this idea basically that government was becoming unmanageable because it was taking on so many things. Now, that is much more true now than probably it's ever been before. Government has just grown and grown and grown. And as you just indicated, from football regulators to vaping bans or whatever, there's almost nothing that the government won't try and insert itself into. And in a way, it's surprising that concept of government overload, I don't think, you don't hear that very much anymore. But it seems to me to be like one of the key pathologies that we have. And I mean, everybody in kind of the private sector, any business will know if you try and do everything, you end up achieving nothing.
Yeah.
Like, you have to focus on the things that are really important and do them well. And we're a million miles away from that in the public sector, I think. And I'm not sure what drives it. I suppose, you talk about manifestos, party manifestos, and why do you have to have a policy on literally everything? And I'm told this is kind of an important stakeholder management thing for the political parties, because there'll be some campaign group who will say, they don't care about us. They didn't even mention this niche issue in their manifesto.
People will control F as soon as the manifestos are out and say, and it will be an attack like, oh, they only mentioned farms 12 times in their manifesto. We can't trust them, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would sometimes like to see a politician when they ask, what do you plan to do about X, Y, and Z, to say nothing. No, that's not our job.
Having been on the inside, I could say the overwhelming pressure to say something and do something on everything is crazy. And it's partly media driven, it's partly, this is probably a much deeper topic than to go into now, but there is constant pressure from MPs, from campaign organisations, from the press, from stakeholders this is a problem, what are you doing about it? You're the government. And it takes some bravery to set up and go, sorry, it's actually not what I'm focusing on right now.
Well, I mean, you could say I recognize that it's an important topic, but government is not the right venue to sort it out. It's a civil society issue. It's a whatever market issue, private sector issue.
You've got to start rolling out your Ronald Reagan. Government is not the answer to the problem. Government is the problem. Or, what was the other one? Don't just do something, stand there.
Yeah, but once you have that kind of rhetoric, it does change political incentives, and you can then no longer automatically assume that if you come up with a proposal just for something, just so that you're seen to be doing something, that will be automatically rewarded by the electorate.
I mean, this is maybe one of those things that probably people in both the main political parties across the political spectrum see and recognise as a problem and understand that it's counterproductive. But there seems to be no possibility of kind of an elite bargain where they say, well, we're not going to attack you for not doing something just for the sake of doing something. All the political incentives go the wrong way. I mean, maybe that's just the nature of adversarial politics. I mean, it's the same with the planning system. I think it would be really interesting to see will the Conservatives, who for the most part claim to believe that we need to do lots more building and that the lack of development is a big hindrance to our economic growth prospects, if the Labour government comes up with good things to do, sensible policies that will successfully achieve some of these pledges and ambitions that we've talked about, how will the opposition respond? Will they oppose? Will they attack? Or will they say, actually, this is good? We do this, but we'll do it more.
Yeah.
That was also in an earlier version of Homewind, where you had a political non-aggression pact where the main parties just agreed, we will not attack you we over this specifically. We won't say you're concreting over the countryside. It's just one reviewer then said, come on, that's unrealistic. That must go.
Yes, I think that is quite unrealistic. Opposition is basically about punching bruises. You're desperately trying to find airtime. You're desperately trying to be relevant. And if somebody else is kicking off about something that the government's doing, then the temptation for the opposition to get in on that is overwhelming. We saw it with farmers. Arguably Conservative Party agree with those policies, farmers and winter feed allowance, whatnot. But once there was a big kick-off, the opposition will get involved if they can. Just to round up before we close, Kristian, you wrote for Insider last week on immigration. I think the statistics were published last week that showed that net migration into the UK was just over 900,000 last year. This is an interesting topic that I think splits liberals and classical liberals and people on the right and left for all sorts of reasons. What's your take? What's your argument?
Well, and the issue here is that for a long time, people on our side of the argument used to make the case that, we used to point out that most of the problems that are attributed to immigration, or the economic ones at least, are usually caused really by deficient domestic policies. So the point being that all the areas where we always hear they're under pressure because of migration, they can't cope with it, these are all things that are either provided by the state or the state controls the key input factor. So you either have the public services, healthcare and education, or you have the housing market where, again, going back to our old obsession, the state controls the key input factor. And we've often used that logic to point out, look, the problem isn't migration per se, it's just the way we manage those areas. It's a political choice, it's a self-imposed constraint. And in recent years, with these record level numbers, I've started wondering, is this really a helpful case to make? Because even though it's technically correct, in effect, what you're saying when you make that argument is, you're saying we could cope with 900,000 people coming if we completely changed the way politics works. You would need some pretty radical reforms across a range of sensitive, difficult policy areas. And, how realistic is it that that's going to happen, especially if you compare it to the alternative, which is just a more restrictive migration policy? And in that context, when you're dealing with record high migration numbers, I think we're not making the most helpful case by just saying, well, if we had a super liberal system across the board, then this wouldn't be a problem, because we don't have that system and we're not going to get it anytime soon. So, I think we need to recognize that this is an I wouldn't start from here position, but given those constraints, it's not illiberal to say, yes, given the way things are, these numbers are overwhelming. In a lot of areas, it isn't possible to cope with them.
Yeah. And I think the thing that's interesting, Kristian, is you've written before about, this may have been the title of the piece, or it may just have been the theme, but picking the low-hanging fruit on immigration. Now, I think one thing I worry about with this immigration debate is that, in a sense, the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater, that everyone sort of shifts. I think it's probably true that maybe immigration has got out of control. There are lots of bad aspects to that, politically and economically and socially and everything else as well. But I think you are getting this trend on the right to say, and actually, the economists have been completely wrong about immigration. Although free movement of everything else is economically helpful, free movement of labour, that's bad because it discourages businesses from investing or something, right? I just don't buy these kind of new economic claims that some people on the right are making about immigration. I think you can accept that some immigration control is needed, that maybe you need a particular profile of immigrants, that basically you don't want to be bringing in lots and lots of low-skilled workers with lots of dependents who will inevitably be a kind of a welfare state burden or net drains on public resources and stuff over time. And yet that gets conflated with, high-skilled people. And actually, it's not always about high skills. It's not always about high salaries. Sometimes low-paid workers can boost the economy by making the people who are already here more productive, by freeing them up to focus on higher value things. So I don't think we should lose the economic side of this argument. But I think, to go back to that piece that you wrote, it's sort of strange that there isn't really, as far as I can tell, an effort to say, okay, well, we do have a kind of government-controlled migration system, or that's what people want. How do we optimize it economically? How do we get the best possible type of immigration for us? And as you've said, there are some kind of easy things we could do there, but we never really have that argument. It seems to be a little bit, you've got to be in favour of all or nothing.
Yeah, there is definitely a danger now of the pendulum swinging too far in the opposite direction, with everyone becoming a restrictionist on immigration. So, of course, when you have 900,000 people coming, you can't make the same arguments that you used to make when it was 200,000. You have to tailor those arguments to the circumstances. But nonetheless, the arguments that we used I said they're not that helpful in the current context, but it doesn't mean that they were all completely wrong. They're all the old line that most of it is really about domestic policies. It's still technically correct, and it's sometimes worth making the point, just because nobody else is making it, and sometimes you have to show that if you see things in a broader context, rates of population growth have been higher in the past, have been and are now higher in some parts of the world, and it's the constraints that we have on making this work are not God-given, and they're not somehow a force of nature. They are ultimately a political choice, even if that is a political choice where we know and can accept it's not going to change over the next 2 or 3 years or so. But it's nonetheless worth highlighting that it remains true that you don't hear complaints about how the retail sector can't cope. They're not saying, "Oh no, there's too much demand. It's so terrible. We've got empty shelves all the time." But if we had a government-controlled retail sector, that's exactly what would happen. And then you would have the Nigel Farage-type politicians saying, "Well, our national retail service, of course, it can't cope with those population numbers, so we need to have stricter border controls."
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In your piece, I think, if it wrapped up by saying Liberals need to have their first preference as to how things should run, but also their second, third and fourth, depending on the political climate we're working in, which is effectively why we exist here at the IEA. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today on the IEA podcast, but thank you for joining us. We'll be here again next week. If you want to read what we're doing and keep up to date with our events and everything else that we're putting out, then do subscribe to us on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. Thanks very much.